So today I thought I would go through the full range of Containerwise trays that I've got, which is most of them, and I'll compare and contrast them with the trays that I previously was pretty happy with, and we'll see, what the relative pros and cons are of all these different trays. And I'll show you them like this, the kind of raw trays as I talk about them, but I've also got them with things growing in them, so we can kind of compare and contrast the sort of growing performance, and also kind of position them in terms of which types of veggies they might really suit. Because some of them, for example, were developed primarily, I think, for trees, and then they're kind of being repurposed into the veg growing world. So there's three kind of collections in a way, I suppose, from Containerwise. So the first one is their kind of original products, like this 40 cell tray here, and then this kind of semi kind of root trainer sort of tray, which is a bit deeper than this one, and then this even deeper sort of really root trainer type one here, but still quite densely packed. So that's kind of their original range. And then they kind of partnered with Hugh Richards to come up with slightly smaller versions basically of this tray. So this is the 40 cell tray, and this one is the same size as that, but for smaller quantities. And actually that is pretty useful, because I use a lot of these 40 cell trays, but sometimes I just don't need 40 of anything, and things grow at different paces, and so you end up with a sort of 40 cell tray with only that many plants in it while you're waiting for those to mature, because you've planted all those out, and that kind of wastes a lot of space. So quite like these from Hugh Richards, and there's a few of those, and I'll show you those later. And then we've got the kind of Charles Dowding range, which are these 60 cell trays. So they're basically the same size, and then Charles has now added littler versions of those, just like the Hugh Richards ones, which are the same size as this tray in terms of the module size, but again for smaller quantities, and I'll show you those as well. So that's the kind of range that we're going to be talking about. So let's take a look quickly at some of the things that have actually got plants in them, and I'll try not to dwell too much on that, because I really want to talk about in detail each individual tray. Okay, so here's my current batch of seedlings, and we'll start with this tray, which is the 40 cell tray. So this is part of their sort of original range. I really like this tray. I think it's far better than anything that I'd previously used, and by default everything pretty much that I grow I would like to grow in this tray. It fits in these drip trays, but Containerwise also have their own drip tray, which I'll show you later, that is quite nice and is better from a root training point of view. And we'll just quickly talk about root training, because root training is when the roots reach the bottom of this big hole here, and what happens is they kind of air prune, and what that means is they die off when they come into contact with oxygen, and the plant then sends new roots down, and the training part of it is as a result of these little ribs in these trays. And most of the Containerwise trays have got these little ribs, and they help to encourage the roots to stop them spiraling around like that and to grow down. So what happens is it grows down, hits the bottom, stops growing because it comes into contact with oxygen, sends another one down, stops growing, sends another one down, stops growing, sends another one down, stops growing. They don't spiral, they just all kind of terminate at the bottom. When you plant that out, they all start growing again, and they all start growing from the bottom rather than from the sides, and so they go nice and deep. So that's the idea. So that is kind of my favourite, and Hugh Richards has worked with Containerwise to come up with these options. So we've basically got that option there, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a 10 cell tray, and then there's another kind of option here, that's another 10 cell, but he's also got a 20 cell, and they all actually kind of stack I thought it all stacked together. That one doesn't actually stack, so that's interesting. These stack nicely. Stacking is pretty important for me because I have a lot of these trays and they're not all in use, you know, so in winter not very many of them are in use and I need a compact way to stack them. So that's a disadvantage of this tray. It only stacks with itself. It won't stack with these other 40 cell trays. So let's just get these out of the way. So then Charles basically comes up with this idea, which is a much smaller tray, 60 cells in the same space that you got 40. And of course, not very many people grow 60 of anything. So we've also got these smaller versions of those trays and they actually stack quite nicely. And there's a bigger version of this as well, which you can use. And I'll talk about the kind of pros and cons of this, but there's a couple of things to note. One is these don't have any root training ribs in these. They're very smooth plastic. The holes are really small. I can't get my fingers into them. I can get my little finger just about into there. But because they're so smooth, the plants generally kind of pull out quite easily. But you can also use this gadget, which you can buy from Containerwise, which pushes out the modules, and I can show you that here. So I'll just get this little one, kind of position it in here, and then you can kind of push them all out like that. So that works actually quite nicely, and it's nice that it works for the smaller tray as well, because it's not very often that I want to push out 60 of anything. There is a version of this tray, this wooden popper, which works with the 40 cell tray. I don't like that one. This one works because these holes are quite small. The bigger one that works with the 40 cell tray, these holes are really big, but the dowel is the same size. And so what you end up doing is the dowel just pushes into the compost and it doesn't actually pop them out. So that's not so good. On this side here, we've got shorter dowels, which are used to dib the holes in your compost like that. I don't know, maybe that is useful for some people. I just tend to just do it with my finger like that. So given the quantities that I'm doing, I don't think I would invest in this, but this works much better than the one for the 40 cell tray. So if you sow a lot of stuff, which obviously you would be the sort of target customer for this, because 60 of anything is a lot, then this popper might be useful. So then we've got these much bigger cell trays, and these have also got the ribs on them, and they've got nice big holes at the bottom, and then there's this other version here. So I will talk, say, about these in more detail, but originally I was kind of quite excited for them, because I thought, oh, this would be great for holding plants in for a long time. So in this case, these have been in for sort of 5 weeks. These are purple sprouting broccoli and some cauliflowers and things like that. But the result is actually they've grown really leggy, because there's a lot of plants in that space. And what I would normally do is pot these on into much bigger pots. And so they've got a lot more space. And so there's not as much competition for light. And so they wouldn't be as leggy. But we can just take a look at kind of what these look like coming out of these root trainers, and they actually look quite nice. So you can see how maybe the ribs down here have stopped the roots curling round and sort of directed the roots down, so you can see these nice vertical roots coming down here. It's not perfect obviously, but it's pretty good. By comparison with a normal tray, you would normally see more spiraling, and this is actually not quite nice, and most of the roots are concentrated down here at the bottom, and you can see how right at the bottom here they've air pruned and they've just stopped growing basically. So actually quite like the results for the root system, but actually the plant is rubbish. So, you know, I'm gonna have to take all this off and plant it really quite deep. And even then it's, you know, it's kind of quite a leggy, weak kind of looking plant, but with a beautiful root system. So it probably will grow on just fine. But by comparison with the way that I like to see my brassicas, these are just a little bit too sort of weak and leggy. You kind of get the same results here. I just pop one of these out and you can see the same thing. You can see the ribs. These are slightly younger plants, but again, the root system's quite nice. That plant's not too bad, but still a little bit leggier than I'd like to see. So let's dive into the individual ones and see what I think about them. Right, so I'm going to start right at the start, which is how I actually start my seedlings. And most of the time I start them like this. So I get this 6-cell tray, which is not from Containerwise, and Containerwise don't really have an equivalent to this one. I still will use this quite a lot actually, not just for seed starting, but I'll talk about why later. So I prick out from here. And I'll prick out normally into one of these 40-cell trays, and I pretty much standardized on these trays now for most things. So for lettuce and spinach and chard and all those sorts of things, I think these are great. Those are the sorts of things I do quite in large quantities. Certainly do large quantities of lettuce and spinach and Asian greens and things like that. So I basically am using this wherever I've got a large quantity of anything that I want to plant out at the same time. And so the seedlings that I'm putting into here sort of need to mature at the same time. So that tends to be the case with one variety of anything. It's also the case with most brassicas, it's most cases with most Asian greens, and it's the case with most spinaches and things like that. Occasionally, I will get something that is a little bit slower to grow, and I've got an example of that, if I can find it, here. So in this case, I've got these canaster lettuces, and these took 2 weeks longer to grow to maturity than the other lettuces that were in this tray here. So these would have been a kind of perfect candidate for growing on in one of those trays. So this gives me an opportunity to talk about these. So these are the Hugh Richards versions, effectively, or kind of modifications to the 40-cell tray. They're the same size module, but just in smaller quantities. So in that case, I've got some Komatsuma, I think, in that tray. And so if you need a small quantity of anything, then these are great. I think I really like them. I like the fact that I can just pop them in here for storage. And so I can get 4 of those in there, and they don't take up any more space than the larger tray. I don't really like this one, this 20-cell, because it doesn't stack with the 40-cell. So you've got to have a separate stack for it. And, you know, to be honest, I would just kind of rather have 2 of these. So yeah, I'm not a fan of that. I don't really see much purpose in it when that's available, and you know, just serves exactly the same purpose. I'm generally really happy with the kind of form factor for these. I find that I like to do a lot of things with my fingers. I find that it's really nice and easy to pop these out. Hopefully you can see on here that they've got little ribs on the side, which have kind of encouraged the roots not to spiral and to kind of grow down to the bottom. When they get down to the bottom, you can see that they all air prune, so you don't get a big mass of roots at the bottom there. Generally speaking, they're just perfect from my perspective. They're really easy to work with. They're sort of right size, and having this option for smaller quantities is really great. So we'll step up one, and we'll look at the Charles Dowding ones now. So it's a 60-cell tray in the same space, and then there's this little version here, and there's a bigger one as well. So I like the fact that that fits in there. I haven't actually got one of the intermediate sizes, I don't think, but the intermediate size probably has the same problems that this one does, you know, this non-stackable version of it. I don't like this tray. I found it really difficult to work with. You know, I found it difficult to get the seedlings pricked out into it. Just size of my fingers, you know, just wasn't sort of easy to kind of manipulate the seedlings into the holes. You'd have to sort of prick out a much smaller sort of size seedling than I'm used to probably in order to use this tray. It's quite a lot smaller than this equivalent. You know, it's nowhere near as deep. The actual size of the modules is much smaller. So right at the start, just the kind of experience of pricking out into this, it just wasn't a lot of fun. You know, I don't actually like pricking out very much anyway at the best of times, and this just made it more difficult. So the second reason I don't like it is that it dries out really quickly. Not surprisingly, you've got like half the compost in this that you would have in this bigger tray. Now that, of course, is also an advantage. Half the compost, half the cost of compost. So that's an advantage, but the other reason that I don't like it is you've got much less kind of room for manoeuvre with a tray of this sort of size. Not only does it dry out quicker, but the plants kind of reach the limit of how long they can live, you know, happily in this tray much earlier. So a plant might get to sort of 3 weeks and sort of basically have run out of nutrients in the module and have outgrown the module at 3 weeks. And so you've really got to sort of plant it out really quickly. Whereas with this much bigger tray, let's use that example here, you know, you've got a lot more nutrients and a lot more water in this module, so it can stay maybe for 5 weeks. And that just gives you an enormous amount more flexibility. You know, if the weather's against you, or you're on holiday, or your bed's kind of not empty yet, then, you know, the bigger tray, the 40 cell tray, just gives you a lot more flexibility than this one does. Now, of course, you could pot on, but that's a heck of a lot of work by comparison with just, you know, pricking out into a slightly bigger cell tray in the first place. And the kind of last reason, maybe it's not the last, is that I very rarely do 60 of anything. You know, it's very rare, you know, that I'm growing that sort of quantity. So why did Charles come up with this tray? I think, you know, you just need to look at the way that Charles gardens. He's got a few sort of key characteristics. First thing is, he's a mini market gardener. So he's planting out huge quantities, you know, 10 times as many as things as I'm planting out. So, you know, he really benefits from cramming in as many seedlings into a smaller place as possible. And also, of course, he's, you know, the compost cost is much more meaningful to him than it is to me. Compost cost for me is about 1% of harvest value, so I don't really think about the cost of compost. It's so low down on my list of costs. Whereas, you know, for Charles, again, with his larger quantities and lower sort of selling price than mine, he's, you know, so much more cost sensitive than I am. So the next thing is, he has a lot of empty beds in spring. And so he isn't kind of, and he's planted under fleece. So he's not very time constrained. He hasn't got a previous crop that he might want to finish before he can plant out. He's got an empty bed waiting. So he can take these plants at 3 weeks old, and sometimes he's even planting them out at 2 weeks old, sort of 2 to 3 week old plants, and plant them out under the protection of fleece really early on, much earlier than I would be planting mine out, because I would be much happier to get 2 extra weeks of harvest from the previous crop before I plant out. So I will often have my plants in these larger modules for say 4 or 5 weeks. So the next thing from Charles's perspective is, if you look at his growing environment, he is for the size of the market garden that he's got, which is small, but I mean, it's still way bigger than any kind of domestic gardener, he's actually got a really small propagation area. So he starts a lot of his things, for example, on top of his hotbed that he has in his greenhouse. And obviously that's only like 1 metre square. So he's got to get a huge number of seedlings in a really small space. And then even his greenhouse kind of propagation area is really quite small. So I am not as space constrained as he is. So again, I'm not trying to sort of jam in as much stuff in as small an area as possible. And there was one other reason. And the final reason is, you know, I was talking about how quickly these dry out, and you can kind of see that in these seedlings. Like, you know, these just dried out like really quickly. I was having to water them like twice a day. I'm just not here twice a day to water. I'm not even here every day sort of reliably. So I need things to stand in their trays for at least 2 days between watering if I can. Charles always has somebody there. He's not there because he's sort of travelling around or doing all of his talks and things. But, you know, he's got other people on site all the time, his kind of intern sort of people, or his employees. And so there's always somebody to water. So things don't dry out. So that's not an issue for him. So kind of when you compare my sort of growing criteria with Charles's, it's really quite different, and that's the reason I don't like these trays. But if your kind of requirements match Charles's, you know, you're growing huge numbers of things that all grow at the same speed, you're always there to water them multiple times, you want to plant them all out at the same time, compost costs are important to you, and space is at a premium, this is a great solution. Because they are quite nice, you know, nice sturdy trays, plants come out of them really easily. There may be one other reason these might work for you, is that if you're using them primarily in spring or autumn when things don't dry out as quickly, and you're doing a lot of potting on, so you're taking these little seedlings and potting them into bigger pots, then this might also be a good solution. So that's the Charles Dowding ones. So next we'll look at this one. So this is quite a bit bigger again than the 40 cell tray. So I think this is a 28 cell tray. So hopefully you can see again, modules are quite substantially bigger, and the trays are not, they're a little bit deeper. But the module size is really the big difference there. So when would you use this one? Well, I wouldn't use it that often, to be honest. It's got some nice characteristics. Let's start with the positives. It's nice and robust. It's got this really big planting hole. It's really easy to get your finger in and therefore push the plants out. It's got the ribs in for sort of training the roots, and as I said, because of that big hole, it's also air pruning the roots. So that's all great. The slight downside, I think, to it is, you know, when would you use that when the 40 cell tray or its smaller equivalents isn't suitable? And I think the challenge is that in most cases where you'd use it, let's say you would use it for, say, a brassica or something like that, so maybe kale or calabrese or cauliflower or purple sprouting broccoli or something like that, you're going to cram a lot of plants into this space, and the leaves are going to start competing with each other and they're going to grow a bit leggy. So I would probably prefer to not have them packed in so densely and go for a tray sort of like this, a 6 cell tray or a 9 cell tray or even a 12 cell tray. And one of the things I like about these is that they stack so well. You know, you can get a stack sort of this high, like for, you know, like 20 or 30 of them. Whereas if you stack these 20 or 30, you're going to be sort of right up here, you know, so that these are nowhere near as compact for storage. But also I don't tend to grow that many of anything. You know, I don't grow that much of kale or that much of sweet corn or that much of calabrese or that much of cauliflower or that much of anything, basically. So the flexibility that I get from these smaller trays in this sort of form factor, because these are not far off really the same size as those, but that's just 9, you know, that's the sort of quantity that I might want of a batch of kale or a batch of cauliflowers. And as I said, in a lot of cases, it's like a batch of calabrese or a batch of cauliflower. I probably don't want any more than 6. And these give you a lot more space. So in the space there where that's got 12, I've only got 6. So the plants have got a lot more space. Now, admittedly, these are just smooth-sided, so they don't have any root training kind of effect, and they don't have the big holes at the bottom, so you don't have any air pruning sort of effect. But you kind of, you know, managing the two sort of criteria, you know, of this gives the plants more space, more leaf area, you know, less competition and all of that sort of thing. These give them a slightly healthier root system, and they're more compact. So you kind of, you know, it's a trade-off basically, is what it comes down to. So we'll see. This tray, I think it kind of takes that argument or that sort of trade-off to another level, really, because in order to sort of really need to sort of take advantage of all of that depth there, your plants are going to be sort of 6 to 8 weeks old at planting time. So they're going to have a huge amount of growth up top, but there's no room for that growth up top because they're so densely packed. So for little trees, perhaps, which are kind of slow growing but put a lot of effort into the roots, they're really good. They might be okay for sweet corn, but again, the problem is here is that I don't do that many sweet corn in a batch because I want to do 2 or 3 successions of my sweet corn, so I can harvest it over a long period of time. So there's not, again, many things that I will be doing a 28, you know, however many there is in this tray, for 28 of. So yeah, I kind of liked the idea of this, but in a way I wish there was a you know, the sort of the smaller cell size options, you know, because if you think of root trainers, they're often probably in 8 in a cassette, no, not even an 8 in, it's like 4 in a cassette in a root trainer. So, you know, that would be about a 1 root trainer cassette, and obviously you stack multiple root trainers together, but you don't have to plant them all at the same time. So when will I use this? I would probably use this maybe for sweet corn if I wanted to plant my sweet corn out big, or if I wasn't confident that at the time I wanted to plant it out, because I normally plant my sweet corn out at 3 weeks, the weather conditions would be good for it. So for a late succession of sweet corn where I'm confident about the weather conditions, I'm happy to, you know, I'm pretty confident I can plant out at 3 weeks old. And if I'm planting out at 3 weeks old, sweet corn grown in this is fine. You know, there's no issues. It's never going to be pot bound at 3 weeks, and it'll grow away just fine. You know, root training and air pruning and all that sort of thing is kind of irrelevant for something that is that young. With this, you'd be planting your sweet corn out at 6 weeks. So I never do, you know, that's something I might do for an early succession. But again, I wouldn't do this quantity for an early succession. So I'm kind of struggling a little bit to understand how, in my usage pattern, I would use this a lot. What I would probably do is use these pots. So if I wanted something to stay in a pot for, you know, 6 weeks, 7, 8 weeks or something like that, I'd use these because the density is so much lower, you know, and the compost area is so much bigger. You know, I can water these sort of twice a week, they don't dry out. Obviously you've got no root training, you've got no air pruning, but the plants are healthier because they've got a lot more space to grow in, and so they're not leggy, they're nice and bushy. They're just a lot easier to manage. So if I was doing brassicas, for example, and I didn't want to plant them out for 6 to 8 weeks, you know, that's what I'd be potting them on into, I think. And the nice thing about this is obviously if you just want, you know, 2 or 3 cauliflowers and 2 or 3 calabreses, which is actually what I often want, because I want to harvest 2 1 week and 1 the next week, and then the next succession the week after, and then the next succession the week after, sort of thing. So I don't want very large quantities of anything because I'm not freezing. Whereas here, you know, who grows that many cauliflowers, you know, or kales or calabreses or anything? So that's probably what I would be doing. If I was planting out at 4 weeks, brassicas again, I'll probably use these. Gives them a bit more area. Again, at 4 weeks, they're young. Issues of root, of air pruning and root training, again, is not that relevant really for such a young plant. They come up, because they're smooth-sided, they come out really easily. And, you know, they hold a lot of compost, so there's plenty of nutrients. And, yeah, there's plenty of water sort of holding capacity for them as well. So that's kind of where I've got up to, and I've just got this tray here, which is kind of a halfway house between those. This one I could see myself using potentially, probably not in summer when leaf growth is so fast, but in spring. This is a reasonable sort of density for brassicas, I think, and you can see that most of those plants are healthier than the equivalents in the taller root trainers. So these have the advantage that there is some root training, there is some air pruning going on. They're quite compact, but the plants look quite nice. And then you get all the advantages of these high quality Containerwise trays. They stack quite nicely. And I could see myself potentially planting out that many things in a single batch if it was a mix of, you know, 3 cauliflowers, 3 calabreses, you know, 6 kales or something, and, you know, goodness knows what the other 3 might be. But anyway, that might work. So finally, we end up with this. This is the Containerwise tray. Drip tray, and it's a bit mucky. I'll just get rid of all these bits from it. So what you'll notice is it's got these little blades basically that kind of stand up here, and that's to make sure that when the tray goes in there, it's held well above the base of the drip tray. And that's essential for the air pruning, because if you are actually using one of these trays, for example, and these are from Wilco, then the tray basically sits on the base there, and so the roots are kind of being protected from contact with oxygen by the base of the tray. This one is holding the tray well above, so that's quite nice. It does mean that if you like bottom watering, which I generally don't, you do need quite a lot of water in here before any water sort of reaches the tray, which does make kind of carrying it with all that water in it a little bit tricky, but they are really lovely and rigid, you know, so they're pretty strong little trays by comparison. If I kind of apply the same sort of level of force to this, you can see it sort of bending and flexing and all of that. There's very little sort of bend and flex in this tray, so it's pretty strong. But this is way more expensive than this as well. And to be honest, I've had these for 7 years and they're still going strong, and I've hardly lost, you know, hardly any of them have broken. I think these are only £1. So, you know, again, everything's a trade-off. If air pruning is really important to you, then, you know, these trays are a great option. If you're more sort of price sensitive, then these trays are a great option. If you like bottom watering, maybe these trays are a good option. The other thing to point out though, is you don't need to put them in trays at all. You know, if you don't mind water coming out the bottom, which obviously I don't mind in the polytunnel or the greenhouse or whatever, you know, you can just, these trays are nice and sturdy. They don't need the support of a drip tray. It's only if you're starting things in your house, like I am a lot. Obviously I don't want stuff dripping out all over the place in the conservatory or the bedroom or whatever. So that's, I think that brings it to an end. So that's kind of my roundup of the Containerwise trays and the relative pros and cons of them. So I will put a link to Containerwise in the description below, and I will add these trays to my database, and the database kind of has my suggestions in it of what these are good for, which sort of types of veggies and things like that they're good for, and also what times of year they're good for them, because they're not always good at all times of year. Like, as I said, these Charles Downing ones are absolutely useless for me on the allotment in summer because they just dry out far too quickly. Whereas if I was using these at home in the conservatory under grow lights, where I don't, in sort of winter and early spring, when I can water them every day, and I want the maximum number of plants under the grow lights that I can possibly get, because obviously grow light space is in short supply and very expensive, these would be great. And I might end up kind of, you know, going through the added hassle of pricking out into them in order to get more plants under the grow lights. So, you know, that's the sort of nuances of the pros and cons, and to some extent everybody has to sort of apply their own criteria to come up with their own solution. Anyway, I'll update all this into the database if I can, and I'll also put a link to my Amazon store where you can find these sort of cheap and cheerful trays. And cheap and cheerful though they are, these are also sort of 7 years old, and I've been using them again and again and again, like 2 or 3 times a year, and they're really good. You know, they're flimsy, but they stack really well, and they're really easy to sort of push your plants out. You can just kind of, you know, ease them out by squeezing the sides like that. As a YouTuber, these trays are awful though, because they make such a lot of noise when you're filming yourself doing anything. So, you know, that is a kind of unexpected benefit of these Containerwise ones. When you kind of push something out from the bottom there like that, it's all kind of totally silent. So they make for much nicer videos. So anyway, I'm going to be using a lot of these Containerwise trays, partly because I've got them, but partly because I haven't got very many of these, because I'll kind of be restricting these to, again, as I said, like things like sweet corn or things that are going to sit in the modules for a long time, but also kind of grow vertically. Leeks, for example, is a great example. So right now, I've got my leeks in these pots. Well, the leeks would probably have done really well in these pots that have put around really nice deep roots that are root pruned. Obviously there wouldn't be much competition for light because they don't take up very much space. So yeah, so I can see myself having sort of 3 or 4 of these trays full of leeks so that I'm saving to plant out in sort of mid-July or something like that. As I said, maybe some sweet corn in some of these, and maybe a few other bits and pieces, but I don't have very many of these. But I've got absolutely stacks of the 40 cell trays. I think I've got like 20 of those because I just use so many of them. And occasionally I might find a use for these. I've only got one of these, I think. So I think for a lot of these Containerwise, the bigger ones, you know, they're very sort of special purpose. And I kind of think of the Charles Dowding one as well as a kind of special purpose tray, primarily for growing something like lettuce or spinach under grow lights early on in the year, when I need a lot more lettuce and spinach than I need in summer, because it's growing a lot slower, so I need more plants to feed us. So everything has its role, really, I suppose, is what it comes down to. But in terms of quantities, I would say maybe I've got 3 of these, maybe I've got, you know, 1 of these, maybe I've got 1 or 2 of these, maybe 2 or 3 of these, primarily for the leeks. You know, 3 or 4 of these, and sort of 20 odd of these, and you know, 30 or 40 of these as well, for potting on, you know, anything that I want to stand in the pot, keep in the pots for a long time. Anyway, my name's Steve. This is the Seaside Kitchen Garden and Allotment channel, and I'll see you soon.